Any study of the book of the prophet Daniel has to include a review of the history of the Jewish people, particularly from the Babylonian exile to the Maccabean revolt, some 300 to 400 years later. But before we have the review of that part of history, I want to give a little bit of the background of the United Kingdom of the 12 tribes of Israel, which existed under the reigns of Kings David and Solomon. Under the reigns of these two kings, Israel was a united kingdom of all 12 tribes. But following the reign of Solomon, 10 tribes rebelled against David's family, the dynasty of King David, and broke away from the reign of David, broke away from Jerusalem and away from the temple, forming in the north 10 tribes that formed the kingdom of Israel, came to be known as the northern kingdom of Israel. That kingdom existed separately from the southern kingdom of Judah, whose inhabitants were the Jews, until in 722 BC, the northern kingdom was overrun and conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and those 10 tribes disappeared into history, coming to be known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom continued to exist under the rule of the Davidic dynasty until 587, when King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonian Empire conquered the southern kingdom, burned the temple in Jerusalem, and took a greater part of the population into what is known as the Babylonian Exile. And the exile lasted roughly from 587 to 539 BC, and it came to an end when, after Nebuchadnezzar's death, King Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered the Babylonian Empire. And it was Cyrus the Great who, in the Edict of Return, allowed the Jewish people in exile to return to their homeland. And they returned, rebuilt Jerusalem, the walls, and the temple, and lived in relative freedom, but under the rule of the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire was the dominant empire for a few hundred years until, in 333, Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire. And now the Jewish people found themselves under the rule of Greece, or the Hellenistic rule, in which much part of the world came under the Hellenistic era. After Alexander's death, his kingdom was divided by his generals. 2 of these generals formed empires, one out of Egypt, named for the family of Ptolemy, and one out of Syria, named for the family of Seleucid, the Seleucid Empire. For a time, the Jews were ruled by the Egyptian Ptolemaic dynasty, still a Greek or Hellenistic kingdom, but the center was in Alexandria in Egypt, and it was from that capital that the Ptolemies ruled over the Jewish people. It was also during that time that there was a diaspora of scholars to Alexandria in Egypt, where the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into the Greek translation. That is an important translation of the Bible that is studied still even today. But at a certain point, the Seleucid Empire out of Syria, also a Hellenistic empire, conquered the Promised Land from Egypt, and the Jewish people came to be ruled by the Seleucid kingdom. And it was under that kingdom that a ruler named Antiochus IV persecuted the Jews in his efforts to Hellenize the Jewish people, to make them more Greek and more enculturated into Hellenistic society and culture. We hear of this persecution in the 2 books of Maccabees in the Old Testament, and it was a result of this persecution that the book of Daniel was also written. So that history from the Babylonian captivity up to the persecution under Antiochus and the Maccabean revolt is an important history to remember as we begin our study of the book of Daniel. And we have to remember that the book of Daniel has 2 settings. One is the setting of the story itself, set in the Babylonian captivity. That is where we find Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That is where Daniel has his apocalyptic visions, and the court tales take place in the Babylonian court. But the other setting is the setting of the author, who was living at the time of the persecution under Antiochus and the time of the Maccabean revolt. And he is dealing with that experience, that crisis for the Jewish people. but in light of the history from the Babylonian captivity to his point in history, and especially the visions of the book of Daniel, you will see him retelling that history through the visions of Daniel, then reaching to his point in history, and then projecting to the future his hopes for God's intervention and the restoration of the people from persecution, and to his hope is independence and freedom as a restored kingdom of Israel. So it's an important thing to keep in mind as we look at these stories in Daniel, to keep in mind the history of the Jewish people from the Babylonian captivity through the Persian domination and the Hellenistic reigns of Alexander, the Egyptian Ptolemies, and the Syrian Seleucids, up to the persecution of Antiochus and eventually the Maccabean revolt.